David's gut twisted like a wrung-out towel as he stared at the text message on his wife's phone. The words were innocent enough to anyone who didn't know better. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about it. But David wasn't stupid. Nobody sent a text like that to their coworker after a typical business meeting. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling, the glow of the phone screen illuminating his face. Across the room, Grace was humming quietly as she folded a pile of laundry, her back to him. She looked calm, serene even. The sight of her made his blood boil. How could she act so normal, so collected, when she was clearly lying to his face? David had spent the last few months feeling like something was off. Grace was still attentive enough, still affectionate in all the expected ways. But there were cracks. A late night here, a forgotten detail there, excuses that just didn't add up. He'd brushed off the nagging feeling that something was wrong, convincing himself he was being paranoid. Until now. He placed the phone back on the counter carefully, his movements deliberate. He didn't confront her immediately. That would come later, after he had everything he needed. For now, he'd watch, listen, and gather the truth she'd been so desperate to hide. Over the next 2 weeks, David became a man possessed. Grace's affair wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was a fact. He started paying closer attention to her behavior, taking mental notes of the times she disappeared without explanation. He checked her phone again when she carelessly left it unlocked, finding more messages from someone named Luke. They weren't explicit, but the undertones were impossible to miss. Lunch meetings that stretched into the evening. A sudden interest in dressing up for work events, and the kicker, a heartfelt text she'd sent to Luke. I wish things were simpler. You make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. David's chest burned with a mix of rage and humiliation. Years of trust, of sacrifices, of building a life together, and this was what she'd chosen? He didn't confront her yet. He wanted the confrontation to be undeniable, airtight. He reached out to a lawyer, someone recommended by a close friend. You don't file yet, the lawyer advised. Gather as much evidence as you can. You want a clean break, no loose ends. David took those words to heart. He printed the messages, took screenshots, and logged every suspicious activity in a small notebook. He even drove to her office one afternoon during one of her meetings and saw her car parked at a restaurant downtown right next to Luke's. The sight of it nearly made him drive off in a blind fury, but he forced himself to stay calm. In a way, seeing it with his own eyes gave him clarity. She wasn't just lying. She was choosing someone else over him. Finally, the moment came. David waited until the kids were asleep. He didn't want them to hear what was about to unfold. Grace was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, looking every bit the picture of a content wife. Grace, David said, stepping into the room. His voice was calm, but his expression was anything but. She looked up, startled. What's wrong? We need to talk. He pulled out his phone and held it up. I know. About Luke. About the affair. About everything. Grace's face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she said nothing, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. David, she stammered. I can explain. No, he interrupted. His voice was steel, his eyes sharp. You don't get to explain anything right now. I've given you the benefit of the doubt for months. I trusted you, and you lied to my face over and over again. David, it's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling. Luke is just. Don't, he snapped. Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen the messages. I've seen your car parked next to his. How long has this been going on? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back while pretending everything was fine? Her eyes filled with tears. It's not like that. I swear I never meant to hurt you. David laughed bitterly. You didn't mean to hurt me. Then why didn't you stop? Why did you lie every single time I asked you where you were or who you were with? Don't stand there and tell me this was some accident. You knew exactly what you were doing. Grace reached for his hand, but he pulled away sharply. Please, David, just listen. You don't get to beg for my sympathy after all this, he said coldly. You made your choices. Now you're going to deal with the consequences. The days that followed were a whirlwind. David filed for divorce the very next morning and provided the lawyer with every piece of evidence he'd collected. Grace tried to apologize, But every conversation ended the same way, with him cutting her off, his anger bubbling just below the surface. "You don't get to play the victim here," he told her one night when she tried to plead her case. "The only victim in this mess is me. You made your bed. Now lie in it." The legal proceedings were swift. David's lawyer ensured he got the house, full custody of the kids, and a financial settlement that left Grace scrambling to pick up the pieces. She moved out within a month, her tearful protests falling on deaf ears. By the time the divorce was finalized, David felt a sense of relief. He wasn't just free from Grace's betrayal, he was free to start over, to rebuild a life that wasn't clouded by lies and deceit. As for Grace, she was left with nothing but regret. Luke disappeared as soon as things got complicated, and she found herself alone, financially unstable, and estranged from her own children. It was a harsh reality, but one she'd brought upon herself. David, on the other hand, moved forward. He poured his energy into his work, his kids, and his own happiness. And every time he thought about Grace's lies, he reminded himself of one simple truth: he deserved better. And now, finally, he had it. The sound of Grace's suitcase wheels scraping against the hardwood floor filled the house. David watched from the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression a mask of cold indifference. Grace had spent the last few days packing, her face a mixture of shame and exhaustion. Now, as she zipped up the last bag, the reality seemed to hit her in full force. "David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, can we at least talk before I leave?" David's jaw clenched. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally he spoke, his tone sharp. "Talk about what, Grace? How you destroyed our family? Or how you thought sneaking around with Luke was worth throwing away everything we built?" Her face crumpled, but he didn't soften. She had made her choices, and now she had to face them. I just want you to know how sorry I am," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" David cut her off, his voice rising. He took a step closer, the anger radiating off him. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something hurtful in the heat of the moment. What you did was deliberate. You chose to lie to me, to betray me, over and over again. Don't stand there and act like this was some accident." Grace's tears spilled over as she wiped her face with trembling hands. "I know I hurt you. I know I can't fix this, but I still love you, David." David let out a bitter laugh, the sound devoid of humor. "Love me? If this is how you show love, Grace, then I don't want it." She flinched as if he'd slapped her, but he didn't care. He wasn't interested in cushioning the blow. Before she could say another word, the front doorbell rang. David frowned, glancing toward the door. Grace stiffened, her eyes darting nervously. "You expecting someone?" he asked, his tone suspicious. "No," she said quickly, too quickly. David strode to the door and yanked it open. Standing on the porch was a man David had only seen in the photos and texts he'd uncovered: Luke. He looked just as smug and self-assured in person as he did in Grace's messages. "Can I help you?" David said, his voice dangerously low. Luke shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. "I'm here to pick up Grace." David's eyes narrowed, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." "David, please," Grace said from behind him, her voice panicked. She rushed to the door, her face pale. "I didn't ask him to come." David turned to her, his eyes blazing. "Oh, so this is how it is? You're moving straight from our house to his. Was that the plan all along?" "No," Grace insisted, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he was coming. I swear." "Oh, I'm sure you didn't," David said with a mocking sneer. He turned back to Luke, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. "Listen carefully. You don't belong here. She'll leave when she's ready, and you don't get to dictate how or when that happens." Luke raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey man, I'm just trying to help her out." "Help her?" David's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You've done enough, don't you think? You helped ruin a marriage, a family. Congratulations. Now get the hell off my property." Luke opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. He shot Grace a glance through the window before turning and walking back to his car. David waited until the car disappeared down the street before going back inside. Grace stood by the stairs, clutching her suitcase like a lifeline. "David, I had no idea he was coming. You have to believe me." "Believe you," David said, his voice icy. "The last time I believed you, you told me you were at a work meeting while you were actually with him. So no, Grace, I don't believe a damn thing you say anymore." She looked like she wanted to argue but thought better of it. Instead, she picked up her suitcase and headed for the door. "I'll go to a hotel," she said quietly. "Good," David said, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in his voice. "You're not welcome here anymore." She paused at the threshold, her shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, David. For everything." He didn't respond, didn't so much as look at her. He waited until the door closed behind her before letting out a long, shuddering breath. The house was silent now, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like he could finally breathe again. In the weeks that followed, David threw himself into rebuilding his life. He focused on his kids, making sure they felt loved and supported despite the upheaval. He leaned on his friends and family, people who reminded him that he wasn't alone in this. Grace tried to reach out a few times, sending long, apologetic texts and even showing up unannounced once, but David didn't budge. He was done listening to her excuses, done giving her the power to hurt him. One evening, as David was helping his youngest with homework, his lawyer called. "Good news," she said. "The judge finalized the divorce today. It's all official." David hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, letting the news sink in. It was over. The chapter of his life with Grace was closed, locked and sealed. He walked to the living room, where the kids were watching a movie, and sat down between them. They curled up next to him, their laughter filling the room. For the first time in months, David felt a glimmer of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: it was his to shape. And after everything he'd been through, he wasn't going to settle for anything less than the happiness he deserved. David sat on the edge of the bed in what used to be their shared bedroom, now stripped of any trace of Grace. Her favorite throw pillows were gone, her perfume no longer lingered in the air, and the silence was thick. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. Every day felt like a new battle to keep the anger from consuming him entirely. The doorbell rang, breaking his thoughts. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the kids were already at his sister's for the weekend. Making his way downstairs, he opened the door to find a woman standing there, her face unfamiliar but slightly nervous. "Hi," she said, shifting awkwardly. "Are you David?" He nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, who's asking?" "I'm Rachel," she said, hesitating. "Luke's wife." The name hit him like a punch to the gut, but he kept his expression neutral. "What do you want?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if worried someone might see her, and then looked back at him. "I think we need to talk." David stepped aside without a word, letting her in. He closed the door and gestured toward the living room. Rachel sat on the edge of the couch, clutching her purse tightly. David stayed standing, watching her carefully. So he prompted, his tone sharp. "What's this about?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of embarrassment and determination. "I found out about Grace." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Rachel continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've known for a while that Luke was seeing someone else, but I didn't know who until recently. I saw the texts between them. And then I found out about you." Her voice faltered, and she took a deep breath. "I thought you deserved to know." David crossed his arms, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish by coming here?" "I'm not here to stir up more drama," Rachel said quickly. I needed you to know that you're not the only one he's lied to. He's been having affairs for years. Grace is just the latest." David's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Well, that's just great. I guess she really picked a winner, didn't she?" Rachel flinched at the venom in his words but nodded. "I've been putting up with his lies for too long, and I'm done. I filed for divorce yesterday." David blinked, surprised despite himself. He hadn't expected her to be so straightforward. I don't know what Grace told you, Rachel continued, her voice steadier now, but Luke isn't who she thinks he is. He's a manipulator, and he's used to getting what he wants. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. David leaned against the wall, his arms still crossed. Why are you telling me this? You think I care what happens to either of them? No, Rachel admitted, but I thought you'd want to know the kind of person she threw her life away for. And she hesitated. I thought you'd want to know that I'm planning to tell her exactly who he is. David raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I'm going to talk to her, Rachel said firmly. She deserves to know the truth. About how he's cheated on her, too. About how she's not the only one. Maybe it won't make a difference, but at least she'll know. David gave a bitter laugh. Good luck with that. She didn't listen to me. I doubt she'll listen to you. Rachel stood, smoothing her shirt. Maybe. But it's worth a shot. David watched her walk to the door, his mind racing. Just as she reached for the handle, he spoke. What happens if she doesn't believe you? Rachel turned, her expression resolute. Then that's her problem. But at least I'll know I did what I could. She left without another word, leaving David alone with his thoughts. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, he felt something other than just anger. It was curiosity, mixed with a slight twinge of satisfaction. Maybe Grace would finally see the truth about the man she'd chosen over him. A week later, David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. David, it's Grace. Can we talk, please? He stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Against his better judgment, he typed back, What do you want? Her reply came almost immediately. I need to explain. Please, just give me a few minutes. David's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't owe her anything, but curiosity got the better of him. Fine, come by tonight. After 7. When Grace arrived, she looked different, tired, defeated. She stood in the doorway, clutching her bag, her eyes red-rimmed. Come in, David said curtly, stepping aside. She sat on the couch, her hands twisting together in her lap. David remained standing, arms crossed. Well, what is it? Grace looked up at him, her voice trembling. I talked to Rachel. David's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't say anything. She told me everything, Grace continued, her voice cracking. About Luke. About how he's cheated on her for years. How I wasn't the first, and I probably wouldn't be the last. David's expression didn't change. And? What do you want me to say? Congratulations on finally figuring it out. Grace flinched but didn't look away. I was stupid, David. I let myself believe that he cared about me, that he was different. But he wasn't, and now I've lost everything because of him. David's jaw tightened. No, Grace, you didn't lose everything because of him. You lost everything because of you. You made the choices that got you here. Don't try to pin this on him. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but David felt no sympathy. I know, she whispered. I know it's my fault. I don't know how to fix it. You can't, David said flatly. You burned this bridge, Grace. There's no fixing it. You made your bed, and now you get to lie in it. She sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. David watched her without a shred of pity. After a long moment, she stood, wiping her face. I'm sorry, she said, her voice hoarse. For everything. David didn't respond, didn't even look at her as she walked to the door. When it closed behind her, he let out a long breath. The anger was still there, but it was quieter now, overshadowed by a deep, satisfying sense of closure. For the first time, David felt truly free. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white as the car sped down the empty road. The conversation with Grace earlier in the week had left him rattled, but not for the reasons she probably hoped. It wasn't just her tears or her hollow apologies, it was the fact that, for the first time, he felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just an icy detachment. She was a stranger now, and whatever shred of respect he'd once had for her was gone. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat, pulling him from his thoughts. At the next stoplight, he glanced at the screen. It was Rachel. She'd messaged him a few times since their meeting, mostly updates about her divorce from Luke. Each time, her words were brief, factual. She didn't pry into his life, and he didn't offer anything personal in return. But this message was different. Can we meet? There's something I think you should know. David frowned, his mind immediately racing with possibilities. He typed back a quick response where. Rachel was waiting at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, sitting by the window with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up as he walked in, her face weary but determined. David dropped into the chair across from her without preamble. "What's going on?" he asked. His tone clipped. Rachel didn't waste time. "I found something," she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a manila folder. She slid it across the table. "I thought you'd want to see this." David eyed the folder suspiciously before opening it. Inside were printouts of emails, screenshots of text conversations, and even a few photos. His stomach churned as he scanned the contents. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but furious. "It's proof," Rachel said softly. "Luke wasn't just cheating on me or you with Grace. He's been involved with at least 2 other women that I know of. And one of them," she hesitated, her eyes darkening, "one of them used to work for him. She's claiming he pressured her into it." David's head snapped up. "What?" Rachel nodded grimly. "I've been digging into his past since the day I filed for divorce. I wasn't going to just walk away without knowing the full truth. And what I found." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's worse than I thought." David's blood boiled as he flipped through the folder. The photos showed Luke with another woman much younger, her face turned slightly away but unmistakably intimate. The texts were damning, filled with thinly veiled threats and promises. "This is disgusting," David spat, shoving the folder back toward her. "But why are you showing me this? What do you think I'm supposed to do?" Rachel leaned forward, her voice steady. "You're not supposed to do anything. I just thought you deserved to know the kind of man Grace threw everything away for. She's not just a cheater, she's a fool. And if she doesn't realize it yet, she will soon." David clenched his jaw, his mind spinning. He didn't want to think about Grace anymore, didn't want to care what happened to her. But the thought of her being dragged down further by a predator like Luke made his stomach turn. Rachel seemed to sense his internal conflict. "Look," she said, her tone softening. "I'm not asking you to get involved. I just thought you should know the truth. Do with it what you want." David stared at her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Thanks," he said, standing abruptly. "I'll see you around." Rachel didn't try to stop him as he walked out. That night, David sat in his living room, the folder lying unopened on the coffee table. He'd tried to focus on anything else, work, TV, even cleaning, but his mind kept circling back to Rachel's words. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he grabbed his phone and typed out a text. "Grace, come by tomorrow. We need to talk." Grace arrived the next evening, her face wary as she stepped inside. David didn't bother with pleasantries, gesturing for her to sit on the couch. She perched on the edge, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What's this about?" she asked nervously. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed the folder and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. "Open it," he said, his tone flat. Grace hesitated before reaching for the folder. As she flipped through the pages, her face paled, her breathing growing uneven. "Where?" she began, her voice trembling. "Where did you get this?" "Rachel," David said simply. "She thought I should know. And now you know too." Grace closed the folder and stared at it, her hands shaking. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he was like this." David scoffed. "Of course you didn't. You were too busy sneaking around and lying to notice. But now you get to see the real Luke. This is who you destroyed our family for." Her eyes filled with tears, but David's expression remained hard. "I thought," she started, her voice breaking. "I thought he cared about me." David leaned forward, his voice sharp. "He didn't care about you, Grace. He used you, just like he's used everyone else. And the worst part? You let him. You let him walk into our lives and tear everything apart. And for what? So you could feel alive." She sobbed into her hands, but David felt no sympathy. "I'm done cleaning up your messes," he said coldly, standing and heading for the door. "Get out." Grace looked up, her face streaked with tears. "David, please." "Out," he snapped, opening the door. She stood shakily, clutching the folder to her chest as she walked past him. Once she was gone, David closed the door and locked it, leaning against the frame with a long exhale. The next morning, David woke to an email from Rachel. It was short, just 2 words. It's done attached was a forwarded message, an official complaint filed against Luke, submitted by the woman he'd harassed. David stared at the screen for a long moment before shutting it down. He didn't need any more closure. He already had it.